Morning. The clock on the wall reads 6:15. I wake up and stretch, feeling a slight fatigue in my body despite having slept for a long time. The house is quiet, and this sense of silence gradually envelops me. My husband, Dave, has already gone to work. He always gets up early, and I've grown accustomed to him not being there when I open my eyes. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the old wall clock, whose hands move with difficulty, remind me that the day is just beginning. I sit at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee in my hands. It has cooled down, and as always, I forget to drink it in time. The feeling of emptiness grows more and more apparent with each passing day. Everything in our house is perfect, always clean, always orderly. But for some reason, I feel that something important is missing. Dave, my husband, takes good care of me, and I cannot complain about his attentiveness. He always remembers my preferences, does everything he can for my comfort, whether it's fixing the sink or helping with transportation. But all these little gestures don't fill the emptiness inside. My gaze stops on the dishes neatly arranged on the shelf. Everything is in its place, everything looks flawless. But in my soul, it's as if a void is forming, one that I can't explain. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. Maybe it's just the fatigue from the monotony? Or maybe I'm missing something more? I pick up the cup again, bring it to my lips, but I can't make myself drink. My thoughts once again turn to Dave. We've been together for several years, and despite all the love and care he shows me, I keep asking myself, why don't I feel completely happy? Today, John, Dave's son from his first marriage, is coming to visit us. He'll stay with us for the summer, and I always try to do everything I can to make him feel at home. John is an ambitious young man, goal-oriented and independent. We don't see each other often, as his life has always been focused on his studies and finding his path. But he's always been a part of our family, even though he rarely came to our home. When I hear his footsteps on the doorstep, the feeling that the house suddenly fills with something alive and tangible comes over me immediately. Dave and I greet him at the door. John greets us with a smile, but there's a certain tiredness in his eyes, as if he needs some time to get used to this place. To us. He has just finished his studies, and now he's looking for a job. This is a time of change for him, and his gaze, as always, confident, carries something deep that I can't quite describe. When we sit down to dinner, the conversation quickly turns to his plans for the future. John talks about how he hopes to find a job, how important this new stage in his life is to him. His voice is confident, and he easily captures attention. Dave, always calm and thoughtful, listens attentively, and I just watch. And at this moment, it suddenly seems to me that he, John, has become something more than just my husband's son. His confidence, independence, all of it creates a unique atmosphere around him that feels elusive to me. As he continues speaking, I notice how everything about him becomes vivid. Every word, every movement, every tone. At some point, I find it hard to focus. It's as if I've suddenly found myself at a crossroads. There's something in his gaze that I can't understand. He looks at me longer than usual. Maybe it's just the play of light. But something in that look makes me feel strange, as if he sees something hidden, something I'm afraid to admit to myself. Dave, as always, is absorbed in conversations about work and John's life. But I can't shake this feeling. Something in the atmosphere has changed, and this change seems to be just beginning. After lunch, I decide to clean up the study, that very corner of the house where everything always seems neat and in its place. This study is my place of solitude, where I can gather my thoughts. I don't like it when too much dust accumulates there, because this space means more to me than just a room. It's like a symbol of the order I so desperately need in my life. But today, despite the usual calm, something is preventing me from concentrating. I begin stacking papers into a pile, but suddenly I hear footsteps in the hallway. It's John. He appears in the doorway with a bottle of water in his hand, looking at me with a strange wariness, as if he has sensed something. We are silent for a moment. He stands there while I force myself to keep gathering the papers. "You're here," he says, tilting his head slightly. "Can I help with something?" Without thinking, I reply, "No, it's fine. I'll manage." I realize that I responded quickly and somewhat unnaturally, but at the same time, I feel that his presence makes me nervous. For some reason, his gaze has become heavy, too attentive. It's as if he noticed something that I am trying to ignore. I feel uneasy, as if my actions are no longer as familiar as they used to be. There's something unreadable in John's eyes that makes me feel a strange anxiety. He looks at me a little longer than usual, and I suddenly feel how everything in the room becomes quieter. I don't know exactly what he sees, but it feels as if an invisible connection has formed between us, and despite my attempts to remain calm, I can't shake the feeling. He doesn't say anything more, just gives a final glance at the desk and slowly leaves the room. I remain standing, unable to continue my work. I can't understand what's happening, but the sense that there is something unclear between us won't leave me. Why does his simple offer to help cause such tension? What is this feeling that I can't explain? In the evening, we sit down to dinner. The dishes on the table are simple, as always, but the atmosphere feels slightly different. John carries on the conversation with such confidence, as if every look and word of his really means something. He talks about his ambitions, his job search, his plans for the future. Dave listens to him attentively, with interest, and there's no tension in his voice, just support. As for me, I seem to fade into the background of their conversation. But despite that, something strange is happening. I begin to notice how John finds moments to hold his gaze on me. His words become sharper, his movements more pronounced. Sometimes I feel his gaze freeze on me, on my face, and in that moment, everything seems to slow down, as if in some kind of film. He looks at me as though he understands something, but I can't quite figure out what. We're sitting at the table, talking, but I feel like something is hanging in the air. And it's not just his words. It's something in the way he watches me. Dave continues talking, calmly answering John's questions about life and work, and I begin to feel like all of it is secondary. My thoughts are becoming increasingly occupied with what's happening between me and John. When his gaze meets mine again, I momentarily lose my train of thought, forgetting what I was about to say. I need to regain control of myself, but for some reason, it's not that simple. "Are you lost in thought?" Dave suddenly asks, his voice soft as always, but there's a trace of mild concern in it. I quickly return to reality, smile, and reply, "No, just a bit tired. Everything's fine." Dave throws a glance at John, almost as if trying to understand why his son is talking so much today. But John doesn't seem to notice his attention. His focus, his interest is more on me, and it makes me feel a little uncomfortable. I try to concentrate on their conversation, but instead, I once again feel John's gaze, his presence beside me. At that moment, I realize that something more is happening between us than just ordinary conversation. It's not something that can be easily explained with words. But why do I feel like something inside me is changing? The morning of the next day. The house is quiet again, but there seems to be an invisible tension in the air. I decide to spend some time in the garden, away from the hustle and bustle and the conversations, to focus on something of my own. Surrounded by flowers, I feel myself calming down, as if every leaf and every plant has its own energy, bringing me a sense of peace. I often come here when I need to think, to find answers to questions that keep me up at night. I carefully adjust the flowers, trim the plants, enjoying the silence. But soon, on the horizon, John appears. He steps outside, holding his phone in his hands. At first, he doesn't notice me, absorbed in his conversation, but then, as soon as he finishes, he looks up and immediately spots me. He stares at me for a long time, as if I were part of the landscape that he needs to familiarize himself with. I feel his gaze slide over me, and suddenly I don't know what to do with it. He walks toward me with a slight smile, puts his phone in his pocket, and says, "Your garden is amazing. I've always admired how you take care of the plants. How do you manage to keep everything in order?" I smile uncertainly, feeling something warm rise in my chest, followed by a chill. His words make me a little nervous, even though it's just a compliment. Nothing unusual. But something in his tone, his attention, makes me feel out of the ordinary. Well, it takes patience and time, I reply, trying to hide my unease. You just need to be attentive. He continues to look at me, and I feel his gaze becoming even more intense, as if he's really trying to understand what I'm feeling. I don't like the frankness in his stare, as if he sees right through me, and this sensation is becoming more unbearable. I try to refocus on the plants, on the earth, on anything to shake off the feeling. But John doesn't leave. He stands next to me, leisurely, not taking his eyes off me. And in his silence, I feel something inexpressible begin to form between us. At first, I try to ignore it, but deep down, I know this feeling won't go away. It will remain, like an unavoidable shadow. It's a wonder of nature, he finally says, looking away from me and once again surveying the garden. It's just incredible here. I nod, but the words feel empty, and I sense how the air around us suddenly becomes dense. We remain silent, but there's something more in this silence than just quiet. It's like an invisible wall between us that we're trying to ignore. But it's there. And no matter how hard I try, I can't help but feel it. With each passing day, John becomes more and more noticeable in our home. His presence, even when he's simply sitting at the table or reading a book, seems to fill up all the space around him. I can't understand what's happening, but I feel how his energy is affecting me. More and more, he occupies my thoughts. I try to focus on other things. On work, on household tasks, on talking with Dave. But when I think of John, I can't shake the feeling that something is changing in my feelings, and I'm afraid of it. We rarely talk about what's happening between us. Every time our eyes meet, I feel something stir inside me, as if an invisible thread is pulling me toward him. I try not to think about it, but this feeling won't leave me. We begin exchanging short phrases, but our conversations are becoming more and more significant. His smile, his gaze, his light comments provoke a strange reaction in me, and I don't know how to deal with it. Every day I put on a mask of calmness. I smile, try to appear natural, as if nothing is happening. But inside, everything is boiling. I can't understand what this feeling is, whether it's anxiety or a sense of something important approaching. When John sits next to me, when his gaze lingers on me, I feel a heaviness in my chest. Sometimes I hope that it's just a coincidence, that there's nothing special about him. But these moments keep accumulating, and I can't escape them. Today, we sat down for dinner again, and I noticed how Dave was talking about something of his own, and I couldn't focus at all. All my thoughts were occupied by John. I felt how his gaze subtly kept returning to me, and every time I tried to speak with Dave, I felt like I couldn't concentrate. After dinner, when I was cleaning up in the kitchen, John came up to me and said, "Don't you want to talk? You seemed a bit lost in thought today." I replied that everything was fine, that I was just tired, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I try to avoid open conversations because I'm afraid it might lead to something I won't be able to stop. I try to control my feelings, but they're becoming stronger and stronger. What should I do with this? How do I put everything back in its place when something inside me is pulling me toward this person, with whom I shouldn't feel such a pull? One day, deciding that I need to distract myself, I decide to go for a walk. The last time I went outside, it didn't give me the relief I was hoping for, but I hope this time will be different. I find the usual route, the familiar path through the park where I can walk, breathe the fresh air, and perhaps, even if only for a moment, forget about what's going on in my head. I walk down the street slowly, breathing in the cold evening air, feeling how it gently cools my face. But after a while, I begin to feel that something is off. I glance behind me and see John walking behind me. He's silent, his steps soft but steady. I realize he's following me, but I can't figure out what to do about it. Anxiety immediately rises inside me, but I decide not to say anything. Maybe it's just a coincidence? We walk in silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. I try to focus on my breathing, on how my feet touch the ground, to forget about everything. But every time I feel his presence nearby, I feel uncomfortable. He doesn't say a word, but I know he's there. And this fact makes my heart race. When we reach the park, I don't know what to do. The situation has become unbearable. We're both silent, but the tension between us is palpable, like an invisible thread. I stop, and he does too, standing next to me, not taking his eyes off me. Do you come here often? John finally breaks the silence. I nod, feeling how this simple question becomes something more. He stands next to me, and although he doesn't say anything more, I feel that in his silence there's something important, something that concerns only the two of us. I can't avoid this feeling. This is not just a walk. It's something much more significant. Yes, sometimes, I reply, feeling his gaze still on me. He smiles, but that smile is strange. It's not like usual. There's something more in it that I can't explain. He doesn't try to guess what I'm going through. But something in his tone, in his gaze, makes me feel as if he knows exactly what I'm experiencing. It scares me, and at the same time, it draws me in. I feel the boundaries between us blur, something insurmountable forming between us, and I can't stop it. We stand in the park, surrounded by the evening silence. I know that this moment won't just pass. We both know that something has changed now. Dave suggested going to the mountains for the weekend. We need a change of scenery, he said, to relax, enjoy nature. It didn't seem like anything special. A small cabin by the lake, a few days of quiet and peace, an opportunity to unwind. I agreed, hoping that this trip would help me rid myself of the intrusive thoughts. My inner conflict was reaching its breaking point, and I needed some space to clear my mind. But as soon as we arrived, I felt something undefined hanging in the air. Everything was too perfect. A spacious house overlooking the lake, the sound of the forest outside the windows. It all seemed almost too perfect, as if it was created to remind me that I had a chance to find peace. But I couldn't shake the anxiety. John was with us. He didn't speak much, didn't show too much activity, but his presence in the house felt particularly intense. He was almost everywhere. His gaze, his behavior, his calmness, which seemed strange in this setting. Everything about him was quiet and balanced, but I could feel that he definitely understood something that I couldn't quite grasp. In the evening, when Dave went for a walk along the lake, I found myself on the terrace alone with John. We both remained silent, but it wasn't the usual silence. It was a silence filled with unresolved tension. I knew he wanted to say something, but he remained quiet. And probably I didn't want that confession to be spoken aloud either. And then, as if it had been carefully planned, John said, "You're changing, I can feel it." I froze, not knowing how to respond. We both stood there, and the moment between us grew more and more intense. "I don't understand what's happening," he continued, looking into the darkness as if trying to find the answer in the starless sky. "But I know you're going through something, and it can't keep going like this unless you figure out how to deal with it." His words hung in the air. I couldn't reply. My heart was beating faster than I could control. I couldn't accept his words. Everything was too tangled. "I can't talk about it right now," I answered, trying to hide my worry, but not knowing how to shake the feeling that something between us was becoming more than just a conversation. John was silent for a few seconds, then quietly said, "I understand. But I'm still here if you want to talk." At that moment, I felt how his words were teetering on the edge of something important. It wasn't just words of comfort. It was an acknowledgement that he too felt something changing. We both knew it, but we kept avoiding it, as if unwilling to admit what had happened. I couldn't shake the thought that this trip, this break, these few days away from everything, were just an attempt to postpone the inevitable. In the evening, when the sun had begun to set behind the horizon, I decided to take a walk along the shore of the lake. Dave was busy in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and John had disappeared somewhere inside the house. I thought I would be able to spend a little time alone, breathe in the fresh air, and regain my balance after everything that had been happening in the past few days. But as I reached the terrace and stepped onto the path, I suddenly noticed John walking toward me along the water. He approached, and for a moment we both stood in silence. The sound of the water and the light evening breeze were the only sounds in this place. There was something in his silence that I already knew. He stood next to me, and I felt that everything that had been happening between us would lead us to a new level. We could no longer hide what had become obvious. And at that moment, he said, "You're changing, and I can feel it. I know you don't like it, but it's true. You can't keep ignoring your feelings." I froze, and suddenly everything in my head started spinning. His words weren't just an observation. They sounded like a confession, like a revelation. I tried to collect my thoughts, but couldn't find a single right word to respond. "I don't know what to do, John," I blurted out. "I don't know how to stop all of this." He sighed quietly, as if he understood how I was feeling. He didn't try to justify his words, didn't try to say that everything would be okay. He just stood next to me, looking at me. I felt how his gaze penetrated me, how he could see what I was trying to hide but could no longer ignore. "We both know we can't keep going like this," he said. "You feel it, don't you? You can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I feel you changing, and I know you feel it too. But I can't help you if you don't open up." I stood there, not knowing what to do. The wind blew through my hair, and everything seemed to slow down, as if the world around us had frozen in anticipation. I looked into his eyes, and there was something in them that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just attention or concern. It was something deeper. I tried to understand what it was. "I don't want it to be this way," I finally said. "But I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to turn everything back." John was silent, and his gaze became even more serious, but not harsh. He seemed to understand me better than I understood myself. We both stood there together, and that silence became the final step toward the realization that we couldn't go back to what we had before. We both knew that something was inevitably changing, but I couldn't understand how we were supposed to deal with it. At that moment, I understood that there was no going back. A few days later, I could no longer ignore what was happening between us. All the events, conversations, glances, they were creating unbearable tension that I could no longer fight. John and I continued to avoid honest conversations, but it had become pointless. Each day was getting harder. Every look, every gesture, every word seemed to accumulate an invisible weight. I decided that I had to talk to him. Deep down, I knew that avoiding this conversation was no longer possible. I couldn't live in this vacuum anymore. All these feelings I had been trying to ignore had become unbearable, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was as it was before. In the evening, when Dave went to the store, I invited John to the living room. We sat across from each other, and I could feel how, with each passing moment, the tension between us grew. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come out. He was the first to break the silence. "You want to talk, don't you?" he said quietly, but with confidence, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. I nodded, unable to speak, and after a pause, I whispered, "I can't hide this anymore. I can't keep pretending everything is fine. What's happening between us? I can't just ignore this feeling." John remained silent, his gaze fixed on me, but he didn't rush to answer. I continued, not knowing how to end it. "It's strange, and I can't explain exactly what I feel. I've tried to find a logical explanation to justify myself, but I can't. Everything in my head is tangled, and I don't know what to do." He looked at me with a mixture of understanding and sadness, as if he knew exactly what I was going through. He said quietly, "You don't have to explain. We both understand that this isn't just a coincidence. This isn't what we planned, but it has already happened, and now we can't undo it." His words echoed in my chest. I couldn't believe he was saying exactly what I was thinking. We both knew that this was more than just a misunderstanding or a mistake. It wasn't something we could easily justify or hide. We both understood that the choice before us was this: to acknowledge it or continue living with it, hiding from ourselves. I slowly sighed and looked at him, feeling my anxiety gradually fading away. We both understood that now there was no choice before us, only inevitability. But it was much more complicated than just acknowledging it. It was the acknowledgement that changes had happened between us that couldn't be ignored. "And what do we do now?" I asked, almost in a whisper. John shook his head, not giving a clear answer. "I don't know," he said. "But we need to figure things out before we do anything. We can't keep going unless we accept this. And I don't know what's ahead, but one thing I know for sure, we can't keep living in this uncertain state." I sat silently, realizing that our acknowledgement had brought us to a turning point. We could no longer stay indifferent to what was happening. But how do we move forward? That was the only thing that remained unclear, though deep down I understood that no words would be able to bring us back to what we had before. After that night in the living room, I couldn't return to my usual life. Everything that seemed stable now seemed to be slipping away. John and I continued to avoid open conversations, but the silence, this invisible connection between us, only grew stronger. Every glance, every silence, they were all part of something I couldn't control. Everything that was happening required a decision, and I felt more and more that something in my life was falling apart. A few days later, my neighbor unexpectedly came over. We weren't close, but we knew each other, and she often stopped by to chat. Today, her visit felt like an unexpected awakening. She said she had noticed a strange atmosphere in our house and that she didn't like how everything had changed here. There was something straightforward in her words that made me feel like my own doubts were becoming reality. She sat at the table, and I listened to her, feeling the pressure of her gaze on me. She didn't say anything specific, but her remarks made me reflect. I couldn't keep avoiding what was happening. I knew that now everything would only become more obvious. After her visit, I found myself back in the study where all this turmoil had begun. I sat at the desk, trying to focus, but my thoughts kept slipping away. I realized I needed to make a decision. But how? John was no longer just Dave's son. He had become a part of my life, even though this wasn't what I had planned. This wasn't a simple matter of choosing between two people. It was a rethinking of everything I had once considered stable. And now I needed to choose. What should I do? And most importantly, what did I want? In that moment, I realized I couldn't stay in this uncertainty. I had to move forward. I needed to make a decision so I could live differently, or everything would be destroyed. I didn't know what to do, but in that moment, I understood one thing. I couldn't stay where I was. I had to find my own way, even if it would be painful. I decided that the time had come. Time to make a decision and move forward, whatever that would mean for me and for my relationships with Dave and John. But I could no longer live in this shadow, in this state of uncertainty. This was my moment, and I knew that only I could decide how to move forward. A few days passed after I had made the decision to move forward. I knew that a difficult choice lay ahead, but I still felt a sense of relief. From time to time, I caught myself thinking about John, but I tried to focus on what I needed to do. I had to choose a path that would be honest with myself and with others. I couldn't continue living in this uncertain state. But one evening, everything changed. Dave and I were sitting down for dinner. He was in his usual mood, calm, rational, as always, and John had somewhat reluctantly joined us, sitting silently at the table. The atmosphere was tense again, as if everyone knew that this moment had to come. Suddenly, at the most unexpected moment, Dave put down his fork, looked at me, and said, "I know you're going through something, and I don't want you to feel guilty." I froze. His words shocked me. He was looking at me with such sincerity that I couldn't believe my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to hide my confusion. Dave sighed, and in his gaze, there was not only care but something more, as if he knew something I couldn't even begin to guess. "I've noticed for a while that you've changed, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't understand what's going on," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I've seen the way you look at John, and I know it's not just that." He knew? How could he know? Thousands of thoughts raced through my head, but I couldn't find a single word to respond. I don't think you're to blame for this, Dave continued, but I need you to know that I was ready to let you go if you decide that would be best for everyone. I couldn't believe my ears. Dave knew everything, and his words were an unexpected